By 1909, Lloyd George and Churchill had become the most talked about partnership in British politics.
Some people even mocked them by calling them the Heavenly Twins. Their harshest opponents gave them even less flattering names.
Together, they challenged the House of Lords and laid the foundations of a modern welfare state.
But beneath the surface, rivalry was already beginning to replace harmony.
This is episode 2 of our series on Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George, the Heavenly Twins. Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me is Dr. Warren Dockter, the Tom Jones to my Engelbert Humperdinck. How are you, Warren?
It's not unusual to be on a show with you, Richard. Tom Jones.
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about Winston Churchill and Lloyd George again today, because we're coming up to one of my favorite parts in this story, and that is around what's the people's budget. I'm going to let you frame this better than I am, but I just want to say this particular part of Churchill's story, I think, is often neglected because this is a downright liberal, if not progressive, element of his politics and of his story. And because of biographers like Andrew Roberts and others, they kind of try to forget that Churchill was at times quite a radical, progressive thinker. And so this gives us a chance to address this, I think, today.
Yeah, and so let's remember that Churchill, who left the Conservative Party in 1904, ended up being quite widely hated by many Tories because they saw him as a traitor or even as a class traitor. And so it wasn't just the fact that he'd switched party, but it was the sort of these new causes which he espoused. I guess there are some questions about how sincere he was in this uptake of social reform as a theme. I would say he was perfectly sincere, but he didn't necessarily understand the issues. He didn't really necessarily grasp the true challenges of working class life in a way in which Lloyd George, although not really working class himself, was certainly closer to the common people. And so there's a degree to which Churchill sort of adopted enthusiasms, like he was genuinely enthusiastic and would put a lot of effort into these things, but they wouldn't always last. And I think there was a sort of element there which is relevant to a quotation from Lloyd George about Churchill, which says, he is just like an actor. He likes the limelight and the approbation of the pit. So somebody who has kind of realized that you can get a lot of support by talking about social reform and being a bit rude about the upper classes, even if you're a member of the upper classes, in fact.
But I can't help but think that in Churchill's mind, what he's doing here is basically an echo of his father's position of Tory democracy. And this is just a new iteration of Tory democracy that is more progressive and better for the working class from Churchill's POV.
Yeah.
And so he and Lloyd George do start working together in 1909 to try to sort these kinds of things out because the Liberal government was kind of facing a terrible financial black hole, in part caused by pensions.
Right. So this is really important context. And I would say, in the light of your remarks, that the things which they were doing seemed very radical at the time, but in terms of kind of the level of taxation and the kinds of new social services that were going to be provided, they might not strike people today as, or they might seem kind of rather weak sauce as people, to use a sort of expression from the time. So nevertheless, these ideas caused outrage. And as you mentioned, pensions, which had been worked on by H. Asquith, who was now Liberal Prime Minister, but had previously been the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And really there was a kind of a miscalculation about the cost of these relatively modest pensions for people of good character over 70, which would sort of kind of left a financial black hole in the budget. And that when Lloyd George takes over from Asquith as Chancellor, and then really had to solve the problems of this financial black hole that Asquith had left behind. So that Lloyd George says, I need to find a hen roost to rob. I've got to find some source of funds in order to solve this problem. And that kind of language does outrage people. I mean, it's always worth emphasizing that people were as angry about politics in 1909 as they are today.
Yeah, and I think the politics around what became known as the People's Budget is almost a forerunner or proto variant of the kind of outrage politics that we see today, every day, all the time. But this is a sort of novel way to approach politics in Britain at this time in the Edwardian era. So Lloyd George introduced the People's Budget on the 29th of April, 1909. And one of the things that it did, and again, I want you to think about this in politics today, particularly for American listeners, and it proposed radical new taxes, a super tax on incomes over £5,000. I don't know what the day's equivalent of £5,000 is. That'd be interesting. As well as increased debt.
If you had £5,000 to collect, to put this in perspective, it was possible to have a very low level, but just about surviving income with a family of four on about £1 a week.
Wow. Okay, so £5,000 is like a lot. So it's a super tax. And in fact, today, if we wanted to say trillionaires like Elon Musk or billionaires, it'd be like taxing that class. Again, this is all kind of linked to what's going on today. There was increased death duties and, of course, land taxes.
And the land taxes are really interesting. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't say that land taxes are interesting, but the point is that the land taxes were not in themselves very large. But what people thought Lloyd George was trying to do was a kind of a thin end of the wedge thing, which was in order to raise the taxes, you would have to do a valuation of the land. And so it was thought that he was kind of getting ready to do a much bigger grab in subsequent years.
And of course, all of this is done from a point of view of being provocative, I think, and then trying to slow down the debate around the budget. Churchill's very much looking forward to a fight there, I think, and using this kind of outrage as a political tool.
Yeah, and also, like, the context here, again, is why did Lloyd George do it? Now, we mentioned in the previous episode that by 1908, the government was running into quite a lot of difficulties. It was losing by-elections, and it didn't have a clear agenda. It was having measures which were popular with liberals, such as licensing reform, so kind of cracking down on drinking and pubs, and educational reform, which was sort of upsetting to people from the Anglican Church, and the House of Lords, which was entirely composed at this stage of hereditary peers, so essentially representing a pretty rich group of people.
And landed gentry, I might add.
Yes, exactly. So imagine who might be upset about land taxes.
Right, exactly.
Right. So the House of Lords was kind of blocking measures which it thought were unpopular with the public. So Lloyd George wants to come up with something which he thinks is going to be popular with the public, and then challenge the House of Lords to see whether they will dare to veto it, because at this stage the House of Lords had a complete right of vetoing any piece of legislation. It was controversial as to whether or not they really could veto a budget. There was a norm that budgets were left alone. But here we are. This is sort of private comment from Lloyd George in 1909. We shall send them up such a budget in June as shall terrify them. They have started the class war. They had better be careful. So by also that labeling, you don't just call it the budget, you call it the people's budget.
Right.
So you've got this populism is a word which you could use. You choose an issue where you think you're going to get broad popular support. You can mobilize outrage and use it to do down your political opponents and to overcome institutional obstacles. Now, one might well say that the House of Lords was totally undemocratic, so this was not an unfair thing to be doing. It depends on your personal opinion, but certainly there are echoes today of this kind of political strategy.
Well, I mean, just going back to that again, it's using a kind of a populist position, almost radical populist politics, of an Edwardian flavor. And you can see this, I think, in a lot of Lloyd George's rhetoric, that he's using that kind of weaponizing that outrage. And so in Limehouse, which is in East London, by the way, for my friends at home, Lloyd George shocked the establishment by suggesting that there would be a day of reckoning for great landlords. And then in October of the same year in Newcastle, which is famously a working class sort of town, shout out to Newcastle Brown, one of my favorite beers, he mocked the peers. And when he says the peers, again, that's people in the House of Lords, as 500 men, ordinary men chosen accidentally from among the unemployed, because, of course, they were landed gentry and didn't have jobs. And so he's able to kind of use all this stuff. And even Churchill got into it, because Churchill, of course, we know is spoiling for a fight. And as the president of the Budget League, he added his own thing in a speech at Leicester, his own sort of take on this, which says, if they, the Lords, lose, we will smash to pieces their veto. So they're really riling the public up about this way to reform the budget and to reform the kind of government.
Absolutely. And to kind of explain what the Budget League was, well, there were lots of these so-called leagues. It was sort of said to be a league of leagues this time, because there were things like, the Navy League, this was another big issue at a great expense, of course, was sort of expanding the Navy in the face of a potential threat from Germany. And there were all sorts of other leagues. And you need to think of these as kind of like political action committees, so that they're not political parties, but they are organizations which tries to mobilize people and finance and campaigning and advertising in support of particular policies. So Churchill is heading up this budget league to sort of support the people's budget. And he's using this rhetoric, which is seen by his opponents as being really kind of class warfare type rhetoric. Now, again, looking at it from the perspective of 2026, you might think, well, this is all rather kind of gentlemanly in the great scheme of things. But I think that both Lloyd George and Churchill are seen as figures who are kind of out of control. That Asquith, who is a more staid figure, less rhetorically fiery, somebody who sort of presides to a certain extent rather than necessarily controlling his cabinet, that these guys running away out of control, and Asquith is either unable or unwilling for his own reasons to restrain them.
Absolutely. And you can see that actually this sort of view of them as being these kind of radical men out of control does have a detrimental effect for the liberals in general. Because, of course, as we know, in November of 1909, the Lords did reject the budget, and that sort of called for a general election to take place in 1910, which was not a great result for the Liberals at all. They lost 100 seats, and it basically meant that they now had to form coalitions with both Labour and the Irish nationalist parties in order to maintain the government.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily formal coalitions, really, but sort of allowing, in the sense that they didn't mean that those parties were then represented in the government, but the Liberals were dependent on them for support, which changed the dynamic of politics dramatically. So essentially, Lloyd George and Churchill in 1909, radical firebrands. They are people who have the same agenda, even if Churchill is not speaking his sort of own natural language. He's trying to sort of imitate Lloyd George's rhetoric and doing it with a fair amount of success, but perhaps not with such great conviction. What has happened is that because of the January 1910 election, dynamics of politics have fundamentally been changed, which is going to make the position of the government much more difficult going forward. And we'll come back to look at these struggles and further controversies after the break.
Welcome back to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is Professor Richard Toye, the Lloyds of London to my Admiral car insurance. We were just discussing how politics has changed in the Edwardian era.
Yeah, so with this loss of the Liberal majority at the first general election of 1910, I think this kind of shows you some of the instability that actually ended up being two general elections. Again, the Irish nationalist MPs and the Labour Party now have potentially much more sway, with the caveat that they don't want to put the Conservatives in power, but they've kind of got leverage. So this is what's sometimes referred to as the progressive alliance between Labour and Liberals plus the Irish MPs. And so what that does basically in particular is it puts home rule back on the table. So this very controversial issue, which really everybody a lot of people in the Liberal Party had hoped had gone away, or they wouldn't have to deal with because it had got them into so much trouble in the 1880s and 90s. Now, the Irish are in a position to say, you need to do something about this. But this is not the only problem on the plate of the politicians. And the cabinet, which I would say, including Lloyd George and Churchill, obviously, is a meaningful body. It isn't just the Prime Minister Asquith telling everybody what to do. And so there are real cabinet debates. And so the situation that you've got is then complicated by the death of Edward VII in May 1910, which gives Lloyd George the opportunity to propose a truce or even a coalition with the Conservatives to solve these really big political issues, which are the House of Lords, which of course had vetoed the people's budget, the problem of Ireland, and deal with another range of issues. So I think both Lloyd George and Churchill are kind of instinctive centrists, and really Lloyd George is being very bold here. Maybe he's quite implausible in some ways in proposing what the Germans would call a kind of grand coalition to sort all these issues out.
Yeah, it must have been politically stunning that Lloyd George, who'd been kind of seen as a firebrand, right? This also hits at Churchill because of Churchill's father and his position saying Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right, which we talked about in our episode about Ireland. So it's quite stunning that Lloyd George would do that. It would be almost like today if the Democrats and Republicans are like, no, we're going to form a central party together. Like it doesn't be like unthinkable.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, the way you putting it like that does highlight the issue that these problems, which can just be solved by saying, well, let's everybody sit down and be nice about it and sort of reach compromises. In an ideal world, you think, well, yes, that would be a sort of sensible thing to do. And yet the feelings are so strong on both sides that it's going to be extremely difficult. You allude, of course, to the fact that Lloyd George had been a pro-Boer radical not so many years before, was extremely hated by many Conservatives. So kind of sort of the issues aside, this was a kind of a big ask, but it does get as far as of having actual discussions around this. But of course, it is an impossible solution, really, and nothing comes to it. Churchill is quite attracted to this idea that you would sort of pair some solution to these problems with advanced land reform and advanced social reform, so kind of radical policies. But he gets rather less interested when he starts to suspect that Lloyd George isn't going to include him or thinks he ought not to be included in the cabinet, which is again is kind of typical of the relationship between these two men.
Yeah, I think that the exterior pressure that's being applied to them and their political coalition, I mean, between the two of them, it's increasing as particularly after the death of the king. Churchill's still a junior partner. That's
Yeah.
probably hard for people to remember that he's afraid he's going to get squeezed out.
But there's another general election in the end of 1910 with the new king. There is a lot of controversy because, in a way, what is needed from the Liberal point of view is a pledge by the king to create new peers, new members of the House of Lords, in order to kind of overwhelm the Conservative opposition there if the Liberal Party gets sufficiently big majority. And the king basically being at least a small c Conservative and probably a big C Conservative as well.
Right.
is very reluctant to do this. And so there is a lot of back and forth and internal controversy about who said what to whom. Did the previous king promise this? And so essentially, with George V, the new king, won't do this unless there's another general election. And so that takes, again, you reach this standstill position, if you like, where equal numbers of liberals and conservatives, more or less very close, plus the Labour and Irish, which means that the Liberal government will carry on. And then having to create lots of new peers doesn't actually happen because in 1911, the Lords do agree to pass the Parliament Act, which removes their power of veto, reduces it to a power of 2 years delay. It doesn't entirely solve the problem of the House of Lords, but it does mean you're not going to get the budget eventually does pass. You're not going to get another situation where the Lords is able to just kind of put a spoke in the wheels of the government's major financial plans.
Right, which is really interesting because effectively the House of Lords accepts a reduced role from being a powerful house to like a consultant body as a means of compromise to get this through. But I think it's worth backing up, particularly for my American comrades, to understand exactly. We've referred to Lloyd George and Churchill in this period as being quite radical. And I don't think we've really explored how radical what they were trying to propose was. So it might be worth looking at. This is actually the beginning of the British welfare state. And that probably would surprise a lot of my American friends. So it's worth, I think, going back and looking at what Lloyd George and Churchill were trying to do.
Well, this is really crucial because, of course, Churchill had taken over Lloyd George's previous position as president of the Board of Trade, where Lloyd George had already sort of started on working on a system of national insurance. So that was your kind of quip about the insurance companies at the
Yeah.
beginning of this section.
The best way to know a good joke, Richard, is you have to explain it. I don't know. A lot of people don't know that.
Well, I mean, I probably need to explain the relevance of the joke. Let's just put it like that, which is to say that this national insurance was to improve conditions for workers in a limited number of industries, particularly those in kind of seasonal employment who might suffer from joblessness at particular times of the year, like in the building industry, for example. And so what it meant was that there will be contributions from each week when somebody is earning from the worker, from the employer, and from the government. So everybody makes a contribution. Then, if you meet the right conditions, having fallen unemployed, then you're entitled to unemployment benefit for a period. And also, there's a form of health insurance as well. So it's not covering everybody in the country. It is limited to certain workers, but it is intended to address what were perceived very rightly as major social problems of poverty, ill health, and unemployment amongst the working classes.
And it's not, I mean, it's not entirely dissimilar from the Social Security programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and things like that that we have in the States currently. And it's not exactly the same either. And maybe that was a terrible thing to bring up. But I do think it's worth Americans understanding. I mean, this is one of the really important things I think that get left out of more recent Churchill biographies is exactly how progressive he was. I mean, for instance, Churchill helped introduce labor exchanges in 1909.
Absolutely. Labor exchange is what in Britain we would now call job centres. So it's basically a measure where the government will run a place where you can go and find jobs that are being advertised. So the idea is it's kind of sort of matching workers to jobs. And as you say, Churchill, as president of the Board of Trade, did that. And then in certain so-called sweated trades, the ones with very poor conditions, there were kind of minimum wages introduced. And so this is part of, it wasn't only Lloyd George and Churchill doing this, because as we mentioned before, Asquith had pioneered the old age pensions, which had become so expensive and therefore required sort of the people's budget in order to solve the financial problems. And so although in, how should I say, post-45 terms, these weren't incredibly radical measures by the standards of the day, they
Sure.
were very innovative. But Lloyd George, again, wasn't too happy with what Churchill did with his ideas. He said, well, Churchill walked off with my ideas and then produced a hopeless, indefensible muddle of a bill. So there's rivalry, and I guess this is what I would consistently emphasize in the relationship between these two men, is that they present themselves often as being great friends and comrades, but there's an awful lot of bad mouthing that goes on behind each other's backs. There's a bunch of guys going around writing down what they're saying about each other as well.
Yeah, no, it's their exchanges. I mean, I uncovered their stuff around Turkey, writing back much later, which we'll get to, and it's remarkable the vitriol that they have for each other. They're like frenemies, is what we would say, right? I mean, they're friends, they're united in a cause, but also they kind of really detest each other in a way because I think they're trying to occupy the same space.
Absolutely. As you say, I mean, we know that they both stayed at the top of politics for a long time, but at any moment there was no guarantee to either of them that they would continue to have their job. So there's a constant maneuvering that is going on. And we see some of the substantive similarities and differences between them when we kind of turn to defense and national security. We see the similarities in the Agadir crisis of July 1911, which is when Lloyd George, as Chancellor, who's been thought of as this radical left-wing figure on foreign policy, really comes out as patriotic figure when Germany has sent a gunboat to Morocco, French-dominated Morocco, which is seen as a very aggressive move which has to be faced down.
Right. It really is a German provocation. I mean, this was all about Kaiser Bill flexing his muscles in the Mediterranean, which he liked to think he was doing. And it was also thumbing its nose at the Entente Cordiale, right, which had been reached between Britain and France. But I do think that it was something that probably in the politics of the day would have to have been answered. It was perhaps slightly shocking that Lloyd George came out as hard as he did, and probably reassuring for Churchill that they were aligned.
Yes, exactly. And so Lloyd George makes this speech at kind of the Mansion House, a kind of an annual ritual of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And writing about this later, Churchill describes his speech as a thunderclap to the German government. So that what Lloyd George says is not in itself very surprising that the British would say this, but it's maybe surprising that Lloyd George would make so much emphasis on it. And it really shows that the government is quite united. So he's saying we won't allow Britain to be treated as being as no account in the cabinet of nations. So what he's saying really is the Germans can't just send a gunboat to intimidate the French and expect that we're not going to take issue with it just because it's not our own direct interests that are being threatened. He's saying we are a great power, therefore, in matters like this, we have to be consulted. And is implicitly saying, if you don't buck your ideas up, we would be prepared to go to war.
Right. I mean, that's the implicit message there. And so on the back end of that implicit message, and this is something I find very interesting. Asquith, who's of course prime minister and famously led by committee, like you said, there was actual debates in his cabinet. He liked for everybody to get together and talk. But he was frustrated, I think, because the Admiralty really hadn't prepared for this eventuality in any sense that they might actually need to do something about Germany in 1911. And so he then takes Churchill and appoints him to First Lord of the Admiralty in October. And as you can imagine, this is like a dream come true for Winston Churchill, man of action. But you can see that what Asquith's trying to do, again, a man who's very, I think, measured, probably too measured, is trying to send his personal kind of pit bull to take care of the problem. So he puts Churchill in the position of the Navy, and this might not sit well with Lloyd George.
Yes, and it's just kind of worth mentioning in passing that in 1910, Churchill had been appointed Home Secretary, or in European terms, kind of Interior Minister, of course. And so he's been involved in some pretty controversial actions in that perspective as well. We can talk about those another time. But he's now put in a position where he, sort of being in charge of the Navy, he's really switches position where in sort of earlier on he's been relatively, how shall I say, understanding of the German position and their desire to have a greater navy. And although he certainly doesn't think that the Germans should be allowed to outclass the British, he's sort of at least willing to negotiate. He upsets the Germans by saying that for the Germans, the navy is a luxury, whereas, of course, for the British, it's totally essential. So the Germans kind of think he's trolling them, even when he's trying to actually be conciliatory. Nevertheless, from 1911, he is very eager to expand the navy at a time where there's already been a huge amount of pressure from the right in politics, and the Navy League, as it was called, the kind of pressure group, wanting more of these new powerful dreadnought battleships. We want 8 and we won't wait was the slogan. And so Lloyd George, although he's taken this increasingly patriotic line, he's also still, of course, in charge of the nation's finances and is not eager to hand out more money for the Navy than he has to, and is irritated by Churchill increasingly pressing for more and more cash. So Lloyd George perceives him as having gone Navy mad for demanding sort of ever-increasing funding for the Navy, and Lloyd George complains of Churchill. He would sacrifice anything and anybody for a sensation. And, of course, so would we here on this podcast. So let's use that as a teaser for our next episode. Churchill and Lloyd George had been allies in great political battles,
introduced reforms that changed the face of Britain.
but their relationship had often been.
It would be tested further in the years immediately ahead
by damaging scandal, conflicting political interests, and vaulting ambition.
Join us as their story continues in the next episode, Comrades or Opponents.
And in the meantime, don't forget to like, comment, and share. And of course, KBO.